آقای عزیز، خوش آمدین به برنامه پل. The war in Afghanistan is one of the biggest international issues facing President Obama during his first 100 days in office. The U.S. president recently announced the addition of 17,000 troops, and a 60-day review of U.S. strategy is currently underway. Tonight, the reality on the ground and what changes could be made over the next few months, with two leading experts. Seth Jones focuses on Afghanistan, nation building, and counterinsurgency for the RAND Corporation. He recently co-authored a report for the United States Institute of Peace calling for an overhaul of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan. And Dr. Marvin Weinbaum is scholar in residence at the Middle East Institute, a principal member of the Afghanistan Study Group, and a former Afghanistan and Pakistan analyst at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Intelligence Research. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Seth, you recently had a number of consultations in Afghanistan, and I wondered what were the impressions from your trip and what were some of the key recommendations in your report?
Well, to begin with, we found in traveling across the country and looking at public opinion polls within Afghanistan that the situation is quite serious, that Afghans are increasingly concerned about their security situation. They're increasingly concerned about governance issues, and what that means is, from our standpoint, was there need to be very serious, what we call game-changing steps that are required to turn the situation that is clearly deteriorating in the country.
Marvin, the United States is deploying 17,000 additional troops. How do you think that this fits into the broader strategy?
Well, it's actually, of course, coming before the strategy decisions have been made, but it's being done with a sense that situation is serious enough that if it's necessary to have more forces on the ground to stabilize the situation, to assure that, especially the fighting season that's likely to come about in the spring, that there'll be enough forces on the ground to be able to keep the situation from getting worse than we've seen it over the last several months.
I think the primary issue is what the Afghans and the United States do with these increasing forces. I mean, if they're primarily used to fight militant groups like the Taliban on their own, they certainly will increase and be viewed as targets on the ground. But there are other ways to use military forces. There are ways to use military forces to improve local capacity, local police, army, and even tribal capacity. So I think the issue is what is done with those forces. I think that's the key issue.
One of the recommendations in your report is that there needs to be more for training of the Afghan National Army and police. Why do you think these efforts have not succeeded so far?
Well, the police efforts started very slow. I mean, if you look at the police efforts in 2002, 3, and 4, the primary focus was first on building the senior levels of the police force, and then by the Germans. Then the State Department got involved in deploying contractors, DynCorp contractors to do it. And not until pretty late in the game in 2005 and 2006 did the U.S. military get involved. But it took a long time for police training, first, to be viewed as important, and second, then, to have a real serious effort to build the institution of the Ministry of Interior. I think now where the Afghans and NATO and the United States have realized this, but it's pretty late.
And Marvin, some have said that the troops are being sent because also there's an election coming up this year in Afghanistan and they need to provide security. What role do you think the United States should have in the election process and specifically with the elections?
There's a commitment on the part of the United States and the UN, the international community, that as much as it can be accomplished, that these be elections in which people feel secure to go out and vote. And so the sense here is that both in terms of what they can actually do, but also with respect to just sending a message here that the United States is committed to this election.
A UN survey reported that the highest civilian death toll occurred in 2008. What do you think can be done to help reduce these casualties?
Well, it's important actually to understand that when you look, for example, at the United Nations data, it's militant groups that are primarily committing the most atrocities against civilians, what they call anti-government elements. Almost 2/3 of civilian casualties are being committed by insurgent groups like the Taliban. For those percentage that are being committed by international forces, I think the primary bulk of them are actually what are called troops in contact. That is, Afghan or other NATO forces come in contact. They're ambushed, or there's a raid, and they call in immediate airstrikes. These aren't pre-planned missions. But I think the better the intelligence in finding out who's in buildings that are being struck, the more that you have ground forces actually conducting these operations, not from the air, I think the better off that we'll be in reducing civilian casualties.
And Marvin, on the issue of the airstrikes, President Karzai and the Afghan people have been asking for about a year or two now for these airstrikes to be reevaluated. And what do you think could be done to reduce the need to use these airstrikes?
Well, I think as Seth is pointing out, the hope is that with additional forces on the ground, there'll be less need for the kind of calling in of air power in order to extricate them from a difficult situation. And so there's an effort here to use forces, as has been suggested in many other respects as well, so that especially if we see now a movement toward, as the U.S. military is referring to, working with the people, getting people out, and they frequently refer to this not only clearing, but holding and then building. And for this, you're going to need additional security forces that the international community, together with Afghan National Army, can hopefully provide. Mm-hmm.
As you know, the Pentagon has a plan and has already begun an initiative starting in Wardak province to provide arms to local individuals, and the theory being that this will help them provide their own security. Do you think that there could be some problems with that approach, given that there's also a demobilization program to take away arms from other individuals?
I think any program that provides significant numbers of weapons at a local level is, A, it's unhelpful, but B, it's unnecessary. I mean, as we know in traveling around Afghanistan, there are plenty of weapons available, so actually providing more to a country that has about the highest per capita number of weapons in the world is overkill. Second, I will say, though, that I do think there is a very strong impetus to have a better reach into local institutions, tribal, sub-tribe, clan, Qawm institutions in Afghanistan. I think there has been a lot of effort on trying to build entirely from the top down, and not a lot of effort in trying to reach out to Afghans at the village level. So I do think there is a need to reach out.
And Marvin, do you believe that this effort to work with local militias in this way is also a reaction to saying, well, the central government has not been effective, so now we're going to go and work with local
undoubtedly
communities?
Here, this is being done with a certain sense of urgency, but also the feeling that if the local population has a stake in what's happening, in development, that there be local people who are prepared to defend that stake. And so that's the helpful side. The other side is, Seth is pointing out, there are two sides. The other side is that once you've created a force like this, you can never be particularly sure about where their loyalties are going to lie. Today you might, but tomorrow you might not. And also, as you recruit people for this, who are you recruiting? Are these going to be people who are really trustworthy? Are these really people who are already involved in militias and therefore may very well be as much criminal elements as they are anything else?
There really needs to be a link between the central government and these institutions. They cannot develop in different tracks. And so I would say, if one looks, for example, at the Zahir Shah period, you did have a central government that could establish order in parts of the country, but when you did get into rural areas, there were local institutions that adjudicated local disputes. But there needs to be some sort of connection so that at the local level, there's not essentially a rebellion against the central government.
More on possible changes in U.S. policy after the break. back with Dr. Marvin Weinbaum and Seth Jones. A lot of Afghans know that the tribal chiefs and village elders are important in their society. But some are saying that we only support the Taliban because we see them as an alternative to what was now becoming a corrupt government. What do you think about the rise of corruption in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the public opinion polls are pretty clear about this. One is that very high percentages of Afghans believe that there is corruption at the local level, at the provincial level, and at the national level. And second, that those trends are actually getting worse over time. So the levels of corruption are becoming more significant. And so what that means, I think, on the insurgency front is it is one of several factors that is driving people away from the government and towards opposition groups like the Taliban, Af-Pak.
We have been trying to convince the authorities in Kabul how important corruption is and the effect it's having. Obviously, we've met with a great deal of disappointment on this score. Ultimately, it's going to require, though, that decisions be made at the very top in the country to take a much more vigorous stand against corruption. So in the end, it's only going to be the Afghans themselves who I think are going to be able to solve this very, very important problem, if anything.
And as part of this process to improve things in Afghanistan, the Obama administration is undertaking a strategy review, and both the government of Pakistan and Afghanistan asked to be part of it. And they met with Secretary Clinton, members of Congress, and members of the administration. What do you think the key points may have been for the Afghan government in this strategy review, Seth?
Clearly, this is not just an Afghanistan problem, but it's also a problem where there are militant groups operating from Pakistani sanctuaries. So to understand and then respond to the regional nature of this insurgency. So again, I think there's been a lot of treating of this as an Afghan problem, and entirely an Afghan issue, when clearly, when one looks at the area where the insurgency is taking place and where command and control nodes are, this is much broader than Afghanistan.
Do you think that the U.S.'s lack of going into Pakistan to address these sanctuaries led to some of the security problems that we're seeing today?
Well, I think we all agree that any insurgency that has sanctuaries such as we see today has an enormous advantage. And you're not going to fully be able to quell the insurgency without doing something about those sanctuaries. What we are seeing now is a more aggressive policy on the part of the United States to both pressure Pakistan and give it the capacity to do more on the border, but also to be willing to do things even unilaterally when that's necessary.
What do you think the United States should be doing to help provide for greater security on both sides of the border?
Most of the activity that's been done between the Pakistanis, the Afghans, and the Americans has tended to be in the federally administered tribal areas or in the Northwest Frontier Province. The area, I think, where there is the biggest gap, and I think that needs to be addressed, is Balochistan Province. And it's an area where there is an important control node of the Taliban, Mullah Omar's Taliban, and the Inner Shura. And I think that needs to be addressed because it has not been addressed. There have been no significant U.S. actions, no Afghan actions, and no Pakistani actions against that Inner Shura.
It's amazing. We seem to have a strategy, and the Pakistanis too, for the tribal agencies, and even now people talking about SWAT. But absent entirely is this discussion of Balochistan. And let me add to that also, it's pretty evident that the Pakistani authorities have had no interest in taking on the Haqqani network operating out of northern Waziristan, or for that matter, the Hezb Islami, Gulbuddin's forces operating across the border, both in Kunar and in Bajor.
In terms of what can be done in that area, if it's just military action without any development assistance, as some people would say, these areas are very poor and did not receive much development assistance from their own government, do you think that could backfire? Any
classic counterinsurgency strategy is a very small percentage of military action and predominantly economic and political activities. So if the instruments used, for example, in the tribal areas in Balochistan are predominantly military, that does not solve problems over the long run. It's important in an initial sense because territory needs to be cleared of militant activity first. But then development and political aid is fundamental. The whole status of the federally administered tribal areas is a very serious and open question at this moment. Should it be integrated more directly into Pakistan? Should political parties be allowed to participate in democracy in the tribal areas? These are all non-military issues.
And Richard Holbrooke, who took a trip to the region, has also stressed that this is a regional problem and it needs a regional approach. Do you think that we'll be seeing more cooperation between the governments of Afghanistan and Pakistan in the near future?
The U.S. has been working overtime to try to create this additional understanding between Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially because of the blame game that's been going on for a long time. I might add that the invitation to the Afghans and the Pakistanis to join in the strategic review is in part with this in mind, to get them to work together, to get them involved, and to see this as a common problem. Because up until now, in Pakistan at least, this is viewed as the American war in Afghanistan, and they refuse to admit that their own insurgency has a direct relationship with the insurgency in Afghanistan.
But in this strategic review, are you understanding that the Pakistani government is having its own strategy review with the administration and the Afghans separate, or do you believe there to be some joint sessions?
Well, I think there has been some joint discussion, but I think the bulk of the activity at the moment is done bilaterally between the United States and Pakistan and the United States and Afghanistan. And just to be clear, this should not be just about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the United States. There are, of course, other countries in the region that have tremendous influence. Indian activity in Afghanistan, Iranian activity in Afghanistan, Russian activity in Afghanistan, both good or bad, has an influence because it's perceived differently. Indian activity in Afghanistan, for example, is a cause, whether it's exaggerated or not, is a cause of concern from Islamabad.
And going just very quickly on the issue of other actors, the whole issue of NATO, and if U.S. forces are increasing, how do you think this will impact the role of NATO?
Well, NATO, as we all know, has a great stake here. I think what we've come to conclusion here in the United States is that we're not going to expect a great many more troops from the NATO countries. And we'll have to accept that fact. But that doesn't mean that we won't be asking them to make other contributions of a non-military kind, which they're in a position to do. For example, we mentioned before the training of police. Here's an area where a number of countries could make a very significant contribution.
More on the troop surge and U.S. strategy after the break. Back with Dr. Marvin Weinbaum and Seth Jones. We were talking about the efforts taking place now on the other side of the border in Pakistan. There were reports that the Pakistani government had negotiated with the Taliban, allowing them to apply their version of Sharia law in exchange for peace. What do you think this will mean for U.S. efforts in the region?
Well, my concern is when one looks objectively at the impact of the deals in 2004, 2005, and then 2006, with a range of different militant groups, especially in this case in North and South Waziristan. What it did was strengthen militant hold over these areas and actually allowed them to continue to spread into Moman, Bajor, Swat, and other parts of the Dir, other parts of Pakistan, and even into the settled areas more broadly. My concern with Swat is that cutting this sort of deal without clearing some of this territory will strengthen the hand. What does that mean for Afghanistan? It means that this sanctuary for a range of militant groups, whether it's Sufi Muhammad and Mullah Fazlullah and others in TNSM, or whether it's the Haqqani network operating from Waziristan, this sanctuary will remain a problem for the near to long term.
The nature of the agreement on SWAT is likely to be the same kind of agreement that they'll be asking for elsewhere in the country. It's interesting, in these agreements, there's nothing specifically here about not aiding insurgents going on into the infiltration of insurgents into Afghanistan. It seems as if Afghanistan has no place in these discussions, when we know, in fact, that that's really what we're so concerned about what these agreements lead to. We do have evidence here, as was suggested by Seth, that infiltration increased after these agreements. And so we have reason to be concerned. At the same time, we have to recognize that the Pakistani forces have shown that they're not very capable of dealing with insurgency. And so what they're doing now is not just a saving face, but a recognition that they are not able at this time, whether because of training or equipment or motivation, to take on the Taliban. That's a bad indication.
The Taliban have said that we will stop our attacks if the foreign troops leave. Do you think that this should be part of the exit strategy for U.S. troops in order to bring a sustained peace?
Well, I think what's pretty clear is especially individuals in the Inner Shura, Mullah Omar, Mullah Burader, would like any negotiated settlement that increases their ability to put in Afghanistan what existed in the late 1990s and through the early 2000s. So if that's the result of a reconciliation process, then I'm not for that. If, on the other hand, there is a reconciliation process, I think especially from the bottom up, where individuals who are fighting for economic, for tribal, or for other reasons, and not ideologically committed to the Taliban version of Afghanistan, there may be a way to try and bring some of those individuals away from insurgent groups like the Taliban and towards the government. But if a deal is struck where the United States and other international forces leave and the Taliban is strengthened, I don't think that's in the Afghans' interest.
These elements, which are not doctrinarily interested in what the Quetta Shura is interested in, but are fighting for opportunistic reasons or grievances, as has been suggested, that these, at this point in time, have no really strong motivation to be willing to be conciliatory. Until we're able to stabilize things and perhaps turn things around there, I don't believe that they're going to want to throw their lot in with people who they may very well now see as the losers, especially if they believe that they're going to grow fatigued of the commitment to Afghanistan. So it's very critical now that the United States and its partners make it very clear that we'll be there as long as the Afghan people need us and want us.
In your report, Securing Afghanistan, what are some of the key recommendations for moving forward, especially with these new troop increases?
Well, one of them is to make this fight less about the United States and the Taliban and much more about Afghans and militant groups like the Taliban. And that means spending much more time partnering, embedding, improving the capacity of Afghan forces and entities at the national, but also the local level to push back against militants in their areas. Second issue, which we find very significant, is the need to deal with corruption at the national level, and that is to start holding people responsible, including within the government, for high levels of corruption, whether it's drug trafficking or extortion and bribery, but there need to be courts that hold them actually accountable and punish people for that.
My thanks to Seth Jones and Dr. Marvin Weinbaum. No doubt we'll be following U.S. strategy in the region in the months ahead. We'd love to hear what you think about this or any other edition of Pull. Just go online to AmericaAbroadMedia.org or visit us at tolo.tv. See you next week for another edition of Pull.